Good evening and welcome to the Savvy Street Show, where we try to show our viewers what it means to be savvy. My name is Roger Bissell, and my special guest for this program is novelist, op-ed writer, and podcaster Vinay Kolhatkar. Vinay is the editor and founder of the Savvy Street, and I am often his co-host here on the Savvy Street Show. And this time, Vinay is on the witness stand, and I will pose a few questions to him on fiction and freedom. More specifically, the culture of liberty and the power of fiction. Welcome to the Savvy Street Show, Vinay.
Thank you for having me and doing this role reversal. And thank you for the subpoena that I have to appear on the witness stand. Here I am in chains on the witness stand.
All right, raise your right hand and swear after me. Here we go. Fiction, like other forms of art, reflects the culture that it's part of. But is it just an epiphenomenon? Is it just like sort of smoke from the chimney? Or can you give us some examples of how it also has the power to have a significant effect on the culture?
Thank you, Roger. First, let me start with a couple of abstractions, three actually. One is from Jonathan Gottschall, and he's a distinguished research fellow at Washington and Jefferson College. And he specializes in literature and evolution. And he contends that we are genetically wired for story. So let me quote him. He says, like a flight simulator, fiction projects us into intense simulations of problems that run parallel to those we face in reality. So therefore, fiction is a powerful and ancient virtual reality technology that simulates the big dilemmas of human life. So we are in a flight simulator, and you can transport yourself to faraway worlds which may be dangerous, or historical worlds that you cannot visit. On the other hand, Ayn Rand says the value of art is gives the person an experience of living in a world which doesn't exist, but it might be. She quotes Aristotle, and Aristotle himself had a view expressed in poetics that if you have the right climax, you get a catharsis. So there are several kind of advantages of fiction. But I want to dig in now into the cognitive science of fiction, if you will. There are 5 things that an artist wants to do. Firstly, sometimes we just want to persuade people to a point of view. So it is advocacy, even though it's fiction. Secondly, it can be a situational empathy, to incite an empathy for or an understanding of a faraway situation, people, or problem in a risk-free and low-cost environment. You may be visiting a genocide in Rwanda where people are getting slaughtered right, left, and center. It's gruesome, it's bloody, and we feel the fear, but we're sitting in an air-conditioned theater eating popcorn in a very comfortable seat. So that's what we mean by a situational empathy. You can also, as Aristotle said, you can assuage negative feelings such as grief, fear, helplessness. The protagonist experiences similar emotions. We identify with the protagonist. And then that immersion experience can have a cathartic effect, according to Aristotle. You may want to inspire people to do courageous things that they otherwise may not attempt. Certain specific literature may be very inspirational. And last but not the least, I'm going to use the Randian thing, which you can have the experience of a positive sense of life, as with laughter, and a sense of wonder and joy, or a very negative sense of life, like despair and helplessness, that can come from a disorderly, nihilist universe that is expressed. If we get entertained, and by entertained we mean our emotions are roused and they stay roused, and the emotional state may vary, then if the emotional states vary, we stay better immersed in that experience. You forget you're in a theater, the popcorn is forgotten, you're so immersed in the story. You experience the story as being typical of humanity, even though the sample of key characters is way too few for that to be a statistical sample. And the heightened emotional state numbs the brain's critical and reflective faculty, so you're likely to imbibe the messages of the narrative more readily. You're likely to retain the messages when the emotional high ends. You're likely to integrate the messages with your existing worldview. So if your existing worldview is yellow and you've seen a little bit of red, then you're slightly orange the next time around. And that stays, it's called an absolute sleeper effect, that it actually reinforces and strengthens the integration, because from then on you're looking at the world with an orange lens. And last but not the least, you're likely to perceive the real world to be a just world if you immerse in fiction often, because in fiction the world is much more just. So with all that in mind, it's the individuals who get affected, but enough individuals get affected, the culture gets affected.
Okay, I see how there would be the cumulative effect or the effect spreading across the culture if enough people go see a particular movie or so on. Um, and you weren't kidding that there is a lot to chew down on. There are a lot of abstractions, but I did hear a specific takeaway. If you're going to go to Rwanda, be sure to have some popcorn, right?
Indeed. That will protect you from the bullets.
I haven't been there. What about individuals' lives? Like sometimes we hear people say that, wow, when I read this book or when I saw this movie, it really changed my life. Do you have some examples in regard? Well, like sometimes there's a hero who's fighting for freedom, or they're just trying to get their life straightened out. Do you have any personal examples or examples of other people that you know about?
I do. I have a bunch of examples of movies and books. So let me just start with the movie. There's a 1954 movie On the Waterfront starring Marlon Brando, and he experiences quite a personal character change, which I personally found very inspiring even late in life. There was a movie called Gandhi, 1984, starring Ben Kingsley, and that was a beautiful example of what we called an empathy for a situation. Because you can't visit the past, you can't go to India in the 1930s or whatever. There's a movie called Network, 1976, starring Peter Finch. That I think was really forward looking. Let me go through a few book examples. I read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged when I was 14, and it massively changed my worldview. And I've since met many people who either they read Atlas Shrugged first or The Fountainhead sometime between the age of 14 and 24, and it had a profound impact on their lives. George Orwell's 1984 probably did change some people's views. Harper Lee wrote To Kill a Mockingbird uh, back in those times when people would assume the black person's more likely to be guilty than a white person. Or she may have changed the culture a little bit. And Abraham Lincoln said that of Harriet Beecher Stowe, that that's the little old lady who changed history, because she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin when slavery was rife. And then all of a sudden, lots of people began to look at black people as being humans and not slaves. Let me just go to a few bad examples of movies. In 2017, there was Dunkirk, and it had no hero, it had no name for a hero. It was like as nihilistic as you can get. And in 22, there was this movie called Everything Everywhere All at Once, and it was so pathetic. It had no coherence at all, according to me. Those two are the worst movies ever made. Uh, Same with the Oscar winner in 2019, Parasite. Disgrace in 2009, I found it awful. It conveyed a very nihilistic view of the world. And even the movie that critics lauded as the best of all time for 50 years in a row, before The Dark Knight appeared, was Citizen Kane. And that's just awful, according to me. Again, it doesn't have a proper plot other than saying, all rich people are have too much angst, something like that.
Um, I think maybe my favorite movie, and this may seem like a strange one, but um, It's a Robin Williams movie, and I'm not a huge Robin Williams fan, but deeply affected me. It's called Bicentennial Man,
Right.
and I think it's based on a novel, but it's about an android, a household servant android, who becomes self-aware and wants to be human. And it's a gripping movie. It's set in the near future and then the not so near future. Uh, but back to your example about Atlas Shrugged, I think, like many of our viewers, I've been influenced, like you, by her fiction writing or her essays or both. Uh, Talking about Rand specifically, what do you think of her as a novelist? Pro and con, just what are the things you appreciate or notice most about her and her aesthetic theories that she talked about in the Romantic Manifesto?
Maybe let me just take on the aesthetic theory first. I think that I personally found the theory amazing. I read the Romantic Manifesto in my teens first, and I didn't appreciate it enough. And it was then in my 30s or 40s I reread it, and then I probably read it 3 or 4 times overall. And it was astoundingly original. And I want to caveat that remark by saying I'm not a scholar of aesthetics. So if something similar was published before or after her, I'm not aware of it, but it is a fantastic foundation for there to be more insights because she does go outside of literature into other forms of art. We just spoke about, the cognitive science of narrative, and that's throwing up more and more new things. And there's also another discipline called neurocinematics, which is the influence of cinema on our
Wow. Wow.
uh, cognitive makeup. So there is a more that can be built on it, but I do believe the foundation is outstanding, and I think the Romantic Manifesto is Rand's probably most insightful and original work, even more than the epistemology or Atlas Shrugged or certainly any nonfiction book. She probably needs to acknowledge Aristotle a little bit more than she does. She does do on one quote, but the poetics does cover the plot almost as well as she does, but she does improve on it as well. So I think she's amazing as the aesthetic theoretician. Not necessarily it's the last word on everything it can be built upon. Now, as a novelist, I think Rand is sui generis. She is in a genre of her own completely. I mean, one thing she's completely outstanding at is prose. Her prose is nothing short of spectacular. But she does do things in the way that the old literature was done. Let me give you an example. If you were writing today, if you're writing especially a thriller or something, you would be told to keep moving and stay in the present moment. Now, I've got a little passage here from The Fountainhead, just a random middle of the book. So, this is Dominic saying, "Put your hands on my back, Roark." Funny, she calls him Roark, not Howard. And they're intimate by this time. "Just hold it there, like that." She lay still, her face buried against his knees, her arm hanging down over the side of the bed, not moving, as if nothing were alive but the skin between her shoulder blades under his hand. So that's a great present moment, great prose. And then immediately afterwards it says, "In the drawing rooms she visited, in the restaurants, in the offices of the AGA, people talked about the dislike of Miss Dominic Franklin of the banner for Howard Rock." And it goes on. So what we've done is we've just moved off into expositional text to tell us what Dominic is like, what else she was doing with her life. Because if you have something covering a span of several years, and if you just stay in the current moment all the time, it will become, I don't know, 5,000 pages. I mean, as is, the Fountainhead is longer than 300,000 words. So
Hmm.
one problem I had with Rand was that she makes the books awfully long. I mean, War and Peace I have the number here, 561,304 words. This is Leo Tolstoy's epic. Atlas Shrugged is 561,996 words. Well, fortunately, Vikram Seth's a suitable voice, a few words longer than Atlas Shrugged. But I personally, I don't think those books have to be that long. When I revisited The Fountainhead recently, I found that Ayn Rand's greatest strength became a weakness of sorts. You mean, imagine that first 2 pages of The Fountainhead, because she writes prose so well. She tends to do those descriptive passages again and again, and at the expense of story, in the sense of the momentum of the story is lost. So that's my one little kind of quibble, if you will. And there is one more quibble: is her dialogue tends to be very preachy and on the nose. On the nose dialogue means you just say exactly what is in your mind rather than imply it through a subtextual dialogue. It's like you're in the office of your boss and you're asking for a promotion, and the boss, instead of saying no, kind of ignores you and plays putt-putt golf in his office. That's subtextual. Like he's not going to give you the promotion, rather than saying, no, you don't deserve it because blah, blah, blah. So there's a little bit of lack of subtextual dialogue. There's way too much exposition in the dialogue. So she herself said, show, don't tell. And she certainly shows in all her novels the consequences of actions. But she's more, I would say, a show and tell writer than a show don't tell writer. But she's the very, very best in prose.
I can't argue with that. I'm glad you brought up that point about the show versus tell. I think in one of her essays in the Romantic Manifesto, she talked about those two approaches, which can be used together, or you can do one to the detriment or exclusion of the other. And she called showing the objective method, and she called telling the subject. Like if you tell, oh, he felt a deep longing inside his soul, or you just give some description of his body language and his facial expression, and you let the reader, infer their
Mental
what
state, yeah.
yeah, the mental state, exactly. Is there a conflict between these two approaches? Like you're trying to persuade people by telling them and giving an exposition, like Galt's speech went on for, that's a 4-hour speech, it's very, very long. Uh, or just showing and giving those kind of cues from which the reader can use their own inference and intelligence to kind of follow along and understand what's happening. Do these two approaches clash with each other, or what's how can you use them in a complementary way?
Oh, that is a fantastic question. Because they don't clash, provided both of them are done well. I mean, you see any of those how to do public speaking courses, and they often tell you start with a little narrative at the beginning or a joke or something, get people loosened up, use illustrations rather than just abstractions, because people relate to concretes as well as abstractions.
Right.
And that's all very nice and good. But when you're in fiction, as we just saw from the cognitive science and narrative, we should not ignore that it's a very powerful tool, provided it's used well, provided you entertain people. And to entertain people, you shouldn't start by telling or even tell in the middle or the back of the story. You have to keep them in the story and demonstrate. So keep them in the present moment. And, things like he clutched the arms of his chair tightly rather than he was feeling angst, or, that sort of a show don't tell. But it's much more show don't tell than it's just the entire series of events unravels as though that is the only thing that can happen. If these characters had opposing worldviews and they clashed, this is the resolution you get. And those messages are imbibed For instance, when I took a screenwriting course, the teacher said our favorite villain is the big bad corporation. And I'm not going to argue that some corporations have been bad, and obviously some are very big, bigger than the gross national product of many small countries is their gross revenue or even net revenue. But that gets stuck in people and from a very small age. And the other examples we took, the Parasite Korean movie that won best film at the Oscars 2019, it was like, oh, rich are always bad. And Citizen Kane was kind of similar. Rich are always bad. It's kind of a meandering story, and I fear that the younger generation is increasingly affected now because they haven't grown up in the 40s, 50s, 60s Hollywood where they were happy ending, good climax resolution. It had a ordered plot that ended rather than ended in a sort of meandering way, which was no ending. So, as long as you write the story well, it is very powerful and it is complementary. But what we are faced with is the literati, which are very neo Marxist, and they dominate the literary agencies and book publishing houses. Their view is that if it is literary, it must contain thousands of pages and be long and be, sort of ponderous. And I don't have that view. I think literary means it should have gravitas. It should be about issues like the Gutschall quote we had at the beginning, issues of importance, not just always a serial murderer who's getting caught or a murder mystery. So, yeah, very complementary, those two approaches, if done well.
Yeah, we're talking right now about the manner of presentation, and Rand talked about the showing as being objective and the telling as being subjective. Be that as it may, she also really looked deeply at evaluating fiction or other art, and a lot of people's approach to telling whether it's good or bad is just they go by their feelings or they go by authority. But she claimed that standards of right and wrong and good and bad can be based upon facts. So, do you agree with that, or do you? I mean, I assume that you don't think it's all just a matter of taste and arbitrary uh, assertion or belief. Uh, is there a defensible standard for good and bad particularly in narrative art, in fiction, in drama?
There absolutely is. I mean, the standard that Rand laid down, I do accept, and it actually came through first, probably in Aristotle's Poetics, that you should have a sequence of events that are not random, that are caused by the events prior, and the story in Aristotle's Poetics, the story begins not at the beginning of the story. That's like a backstory for the first 5 or 10 minutes, 15 minutes of a movie. Then there is a catalyst or a inciting incident, we call it. And the inciting incident starts the story because it incites a purpose, a goal in the protagonist. And then the whole story is about ideally a rising jeopardy and difficulty in managing and accomplishing the goal. And then there is a climax, and pre-climax, there is this in the cave moment. Do I really want to risk my life to do this? And they do most often, and they succeed. The good movies follow that structure. And so having a plotless narrative is saying, in effect, there is no ordering in this universe. It's all a bunch of random things and it's just a luck. And so having a well-ordered plot, which Aristotle brought out and Rand did expand upon, is extremely critical. And that's not to say you ignore these other things about the dialogue and the structure and the good prose. But we do see that even in the movies now, a lot that assumes that there is no objectivity. If you like it, you like it. And whereas even in the screenwriting classes, they used to teach Aristotle. saying, that's the objective. Another illustration came to my mind. Our colleague at Savvy Street, Walter Donway, wrote a essay about the murder of poetry. And he quotes in that coherence and clarity of meaning are the minimal requirements of a poem. Robert Frost said so, T.S. Eliot said so, and the nature of definition also says so. The characteristic of a poetry as an art form is meter. So the poet establishes an underlying pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables and then varies it to achieve poetic effects. And so meter and rhythm are critical, almost like in a song. What we've got now is free verse is regarded as poetry. So poetry isn't a bunch of random sentence fragments. I do. I walked. When I walked, there were dark clouds. And I was reminded of my childhood. But I kept walking and the dark clouds, they disappeared. I keep walking. These bunch of sentence fragments written by anybody, even a 7-year-old could write those. That doesn't a poem make. So yes, we have absolutely objective standards, and just like what is happening in modern art, postmodern art is just a random bunch of things thrown. Anyone could have done it, and that's disfiguring the true art form of visual art. And the same thing is happening to poetry, the same thing is happening to screenwriting, and probably not as much in novel writing, but there is an element of this postmodern left of wrecking standards, and whereas there are objective standards.
I agree with you, and I would say that it's infected my own professional area as well. And I think there's a good reason for that, which underlies all of them. These are all art forms that unfold through a process of time, or through a span of time. And music used to have organized structure, which was very similar to plot in the 19th century, in a good part of the early 20th. And then, of course, we had the ones who threw away a lot of that organizing structure. And instead of events happening along a progression, and sometimes they'd build to a peak of tension and a climax and subside, instead it would be just like things are happening. And there seemed to be no reason for them to happen when they did. They just happened then, or they happened some other time. And so I think the postmodernism really is, to me, it's kind of a continuation of the modernism, what they called modern music, uh, when this all started around World War I is when I think it started. Well, I just think that there is this
Right?
commonality with all of the what
All
they
from
call the temporal arts. Um,
yes,
yeah,
music is
uh,
under attack as well, unfortunately.
absolutely, and yet we do have some refuge, some popular music, some musical Broadway plays, some movie soundtracks, and so on. You actually do hear lovely music, or uh, tragic music, or heroic music, etc., like John Williams writing for the Star Wars movies and so on. Good stuff. So it is out there, and
Yeah.
you kind of have to wade through the other stuff to get to it. Uh, you kind of answered my next question. Although I will ask you, there seems to be not only this push against the objective standards in the arts, but also some of the same people are pushing against political freedom. And it seems like that everything that is important and valuable to Western civilization is kind of under attack. And so, do you have any prescription or suggestions for what libertarians or objectivists might do to save the culture of liberty and to save narrative art from these attacks?
Just a one liner from me on this, which is understand the power of fiction. It should not be ignored. Get involved. And if you don't have the time, support the right artists. And if you have the time, do it yourself. That's it.
Yep. Yep. That's good advice. I would say that too. I'd say, hey, for music, I'd say go out and haunt YouTube and look for stuff that was 40, 50 years ago. There's some wonderful things there. Um, I do have one more question, and I might have a wild card question if we have time. Um, your previous novels, I've read the first one, and I've just started reading the second one. Tell us briefly about them, and also, I think you're working on a new project. If you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. What I set out to create is a kind of a new genre. I call it a new, not necessarily new, but it hasn't been acknowledged by the literati as a genre, and I call that a literary thriller.
Ah,
If you go back to the Gottschall definition of why we have fiction, it's to ponder without being exposed to the actual elements, the big issues of life. Now, I spoke about Rwanda in the beginning. In 2004, there was a movie called Hotel Rwanda. And there was a hotel, there was a manager in the hotel, and there was genocide going on outside between two tribes. And he decided that he was going to hide the people being massacred in his hotel.
ooh,
And it's a very brave and courageous decision, of course, because if they find out, not only those guys, but you and your family, as a wife and two children as well, would also be massacred. Um, I wanted to bring that in because that has enormous gravitas. If we faced with that situation, what would we do? It's not like just a serial killer or a murder mystery, but in literature, you got to classify your novel as suspense, murder, mystery thrillers or literary. And literary has to be like 300,000 words. So Ayn Rand obviously was very well classified as literary fiction because I said she left the present moment constantly to do expositional text.
yep,
So what I try to do is not leave the present moment at all, if possible, or very little, very, very little expositional text. You're always in the event, always in the present moment,
got it.
which makes it harder, but I think it makes it more engrossing for the reader. So I'm going to start with the latest manuscript. I find I had to look for something that had really happened, and perhaps is still happening to almost to the same degree, so that I can write about oppression, which is what the literati wants, but I'm not exaggerating. This is real. And the theme for my new manuscript is human trafficking, but is also thematically a self actualization, and nepotism are two other themes in it. So if you use the Rand's theme plot, it's about two teenagers who are abducted as infants and sold to a circus. So that's your human trafficking theme. But they
Yeah,
escape captivity to find a new life. So they self-actualize themselves. Um, the theme for the one that you've just started, Sharia London, is religious extremism. But the theme plot is a lecturer of history falls in love with a student, and then when his love is threatened with a fatwa by extremists, he throws caution to the wind, and then the whole story is about that. So it has to have a goal. You're going towards something. In 2012, I wrote the Frankenstein Candidate, which is I call it a literary thriller about a billionaire who disrupts a U.S. presidential election by running as an independent. So the theme is presidential campaigns rather than politics, but it allowed me to have a lot of expositional text because I was at that time more influenced by Rand than I'm now. But I like having a character transformation, and in that, the character transformation isn't of the protagonist. It's about another character called Olivia Allen, who is a conscientious Democratic senator. Who that might seem like a strange thing for today, but in the book, she discovers the true state of politics. So I'm still on that journey. I think it may never happen in my lifetime, getting recognized as a separate genre, but as long as the books are done and do well, I'm happy about it.
I was hoping you might do a sequel to The Frankenstein Candidate, and that brings me back around to Ayn Rand. Some of her novels don't really allow for a sequel, like We the Living. Well, the the leading lady, well, maybe I shouldn't say, but it doesn't end well. Let's put it that way. But I know that we have talked about how a better ending for it might have been written, but that's the way Rand wanted it. But as far as a sequel's concerned, what about Atlas Shrugged, where it all kind of collapses and then they say, okay, now we're going to go back and rebuild. Well, wouldn't you just like to think about how the rebuilding took place?
No, because
No.
no, because a couple of reasons. One, if you recall, Aristotle in his Poetics says, when the story ends, it should end with the finality that there can be nothing more to say. And if you look at the We the Living, its message is delivered. Sorry to give a spoiler, but Kira dies, and it's the end. You cannot take that story forward. Now,
Right.
if you were to do a TV series, you would have Kira escape successfully, and then about her struggles, a Russian in America not knowing much English, and it becomes a completely different story. Because the climax has resolved, Atlas Shrugged is resolved at the end. They won the world. Now, the rebuilding could be boring because a story is only a story if there is serious conflict between two opposing forces that are equal, and the bad guys seem to be winning at first, and then the good guys, then the bad guys again, and eventually the good guys win. We won't have that in the rebuilding. That could be more like a documentary, unless someone comes up with a very weird, strange, different plot. But I would caution against doing a sequel to any of Rand's novels because I've never read anyone who could write prose like she did. So the expectations of her fans would be just too high and you wouldn't be able to meet them. The best way to be an artist is to be you, do what you're good at, and
Yeah.
carve out your own thing rather than especially write sequels to somebody else's novels. Probably not. I would stay away from that. I mean, there
Well,
was one Sidney Sheldon novel which was half complete when he passed away, and then his estate did ask someone else who they knew she was a good writer to complete it, and I think she did a very good job. But that's if somebody passes away halfway through their manuscript.
yeah, one of the biggies from the mid 20th century, Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. I think at least one sequel was written on that named Scarlet. And I think it kind of had mixed reception actually. And part of it was simply that maybe just the difficulty of capturing the particular flavor of the world that Mitchell put into her novel. And that's above my pay grade. I really don't know.
Yeah,
But
if you
yeah.
want to write a sequel, you have to write a climax in which maybe there were 8 issues to resolve and six are resolved or seven, but there's one thread left, which you know how you're going to pull it into another big story. You wouldn't resolve everything, and that's what TV series do very often. At the end of the first season, there's something still left over.
Another thing they do in TV series is if they're doing a series based on an author that's written a lot of novels, they'll do a whole season based on one of the novels, and then they're ready to do novel number two for the second season.
That's
Then
right.
this could go on until the 22nd century or something or whatever. Um, you have admirably survived my intense cross examination, and I hope that you enjoyed it and our
I did.
viewers enjoyed it like I did. And to those of you who are watching out there, we invite you to share your thoughts and questions in the comments section. And tune in again to the Savvy Street Show. And as Edward R. Murrow used to say many decades ago, good luck and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.